The Gospel according to Luke, chapter 21, verses 1 to 11. And he looked up and saw the rich men casting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw also a certain poor widow casting in thither 2 mites. And he said, Of a truth I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast in more than they all. For all these have of their abundance cast in unto the offerings of God, but she of her penury hath cast in all the living that she had. And as some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said, As for these things which ye behold, the days will come, in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be? And what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? And he said, Take heed that ye be not deceived. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ. And the time draweth near. Go ye not therefore after them. But when ye shall hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified, for these things must first come to pass. But the end is not by and by. Then said he unto them, Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. Chapter 20 of the Gospel of Luke has been the chapter detailing the disputations, some direct, some indirect, between Jesus and the religious elite and political elite in the temple in Jerusalem, this most likely on the Tuesday or throughout the Tuesday of Holy Week. And by contrast, chapter 21 that we begin today is the chapter which covers the discourse of Jesus on the Mount of Olives concerning the future, Jesus' prophecy, which we also have in, I would say, a similar degree of detail in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Mark. Now, the very first few verses of chapter 21 contain just a little nugget of gold, almost like an oasis in, as one commentator called it, the desert of official devotion, but a little nugget of gold before Jesus and his disciples leave the temple. We learn that Jesus looked up and saw wealthy men casting their gifts into the treasury, and this would be in the court of the women, was where the treasury was. And this treasury was actually established a few generations of kings after King David, King Jehoash, and that's detailed in the book 2 Kings in chapter 12. The treasury was established, and very respectfully, I'm sure, and in a dignified way, men are casting their gifts into the treasury as part of their religious observance. But the point of this nugget of gold is that a poor widow is amongst them, and it must be very clear from her dress and perhaps from her state. Maybe she is clearly rather emaciated from hunger, but she's clearly poor, and the fact that she's there by herself almost certainly indicates that she is a widow. But she casts in 2 mites. Now, a mite was half of a farthing. It was the smallest coin in circulation. And in fact, 2 mites was the minimum amount that was allowed to be offered to the temple. And the original Greek word for these, interestingly, is lepton, and leptos means small. And I just mention that because in physics, in the so-called standard model of particle physics, which is our best description of the subatomic world currently, there is a class of particles that includes neutrinos and electrons and muons, and they are known collectively as the leptons because they tend to have very small mass. So just a nice little connection there linguistically. But this poor widow casting in her 2 mites. And Jesus makes this important point. He says to his disciples, and presumably others who are around, "Of a truth I say unto you, this poor widow hath cast in more than they all. For all these have of their abundance cast in unto the offerings of God. She of her penury hath cast in all the living that she had." I think the divine insight of Jesus enters into this, partly that she is a widow, but also those were the only 2 coins that she had. And the point Jesus is making here is that those rich men will be, if they live in Jerusalem, going back to their houses after leaving the temple. If they're pilgrims, they'll be going to probably quite comfortable lodgings, and they will be having, a good meal, most likely. Whereas the poor widow, that might have been her lodging for the night, those 2 mites, or it might have been her meal for the night. So she may go hungry, she may sleep rough that night. And it's the qualitative aspect of the gift that Jesus is prioritizing over the quantitative aspect of the gift. There's a nice quote that one of the commentators gave from St. Ambrose along the lines of, "It is not considered how much is given, but how much is left behind." And I thought that was quite a concise and powerful way to talk about this idea, and something for me and many other people who live particularly in the Western world, where we have a high degree of comfort around us compared to many in developing countries, to think about when we have our 3 meals a day and we have our bed in a room that is relatively safe from intrusion and such. She of her penury hath cast in all the living that she had. So quality over quantity, which I think is a general guide in much of life. Now that may possibly be the last public teaching of Jesus in his ministry, particularly in the Gospel of Luke. There's a slight question mark around that we'll come to in a couple of days' time, but I think for commentators they regard that as the end of his public ministry. He leaves the temple with his disciples, and this next piece of dialogue here is either as they're walking away from the temple, or it may be as they have gone up into the Mount of Olives, which we learn from Matthew and Mark is where they've gone, which overlooks the temple, and it would be a beautiful sight, the temple in the setting sun. So maybe they're speaking about the temple from the Mount of Olives. Certainly the discourse, the meat of the discourse is given on the Mount of Olives. But some of his disciples are speaking of the temple, and these are fishermen and workmen from Galilee. They will have been to Jerusalem before, but they will marvel at the sight of the temple. As I've mentioned in other, when we've covered similar readings in Mark and Matthew, this is the so-called Second Temple of Jerusalem. The first that was built by King Solomon was destroyed when the Babylonian ruler Nebuchadnezzar overran Jerusalem and destroyed the city and either killed or took hostage back into exile to Babylon, the Jewish elite there. And 100 years later, when those exiles came back from Babylon under Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor, who allowed them back to Jerusalem, they rebuilt the temple, so-called Second Temple. But it was massively expanded and adorned by actually Herod the Great several decades before the time that we're reading. So it would have looked, very sparkly and still quite new, particularly in that setting sun. I think Josephus, in speaking of the temple after Jerusalem fell, spoke of just the extraordinary size of some of the stones that made up the temple. So he speaks of some stones being 40 by 10 cubits in size, and that translates to, in old money, 60 by 15 feet, or about 20 by 5 meters. So these are extraordinarily large stones. Many of them would be of marble. It would be truly a sight to behold. And also inlaid were semi-precious stones and gifts and such. And Jesus speaks to them about this beautiful temple. These things that you behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And Jesus there is prophesying the fall of Jerusalem, which occurred 40 years after this narrative. And if we remember back in chapter 19 of Luke, when Jesus was weeping over the city as he sat on the donkey's foal outside the city gate, in verses 42, 43 and 44 of chapter 19 of Luke, Jesus also prophesied about what was to come in very detailed language. If thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes. For the days shall come upon thee that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee, and they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation. So Jesus there also, back in chapter 19, speaking about not just the overrun of the city, but the fact that it would be really just destroyed, not one stone upon another. And this historically is what occurred. And we have to remember that we see similar language in the Gospel of Mark, which was written certainly in around the 50s AD, a couple of decades before the fall of Jerusalem. This is prophecy from Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And when the Romans in 70 AD laid siege to the city, the leader of that effort, Titus, who went on to become emperor, did not want the temple to be destroyed. He wanted to have it left as a clear signal of how great a city it once was, but now overrun by the Romans. But it was in fact in those last days of the siege, which ended early because of infighting amongst the various sects within the city, but the temple had already been set on fire to, and the fire ultimately destroyed the temple. But such was the zeal of the Roman soldiers when they finally entered the city. Not only did they butcher countless people, we're speaking well over 100,000 people were killed, perhaps many more that number, but they also, just in a feverish sort of frenzy, just demolished every part of the temple they could and dug up foundations. They did not want to leave anything, and all that was left was the Western Wall, which is still there in Jerusalem, and some of the towers. Now, certainly we begin at this point this discourse, this prophecy, which I've spoken about at some length, both in Mark back in end of February and in Matthew, I think in June in the Gospel year. So I'll put links to those videos under the description of this video. As I've said a number of times, this prophecy of Jesus has been the subject of intense debate for 2,000 years, because it's not clear, it's not laid out exactly what precisely in different parts of the discourse that Jesus is prophesying. I think for most commentators, and certainly this has been my conclusion after reading these different accounts in the different Gospels, reading commentaries, thinking about this. So I agree with this general consensus amongst commentators that the earlier parts of the prophecy on the Mount of Olives concerns the fall of Jerusalem, whereas the later parts concern the Day of Judgment. There are, I think historically, particularly in the very early times of the Christian community, people believed that this all concerned the Day of Judgment, which is why they thought it would be coming sooner. But that's not the case, and obviously, Day of Judgment has yet to occur after 2,000 years. But there's clear language, I think, throughout the Gospel that the Day of Judgment would be a long time coming, and it would come unexpectedly when it did come, whereas much of the language in this discourse is about something that's clearly more imminent, and that being the fall of Jerusalem. So the disciples ask their master, "When shall these things be? What sign will there be when these things shall come to pass?" So they're bordering into Pharisee territory. They're asking about signs, but Jesus doesn't chide them. He just answers the first part of the question. Now he starts off, interestingly, with a warning. This is like a warning on something maybe you buy that is potentially dangerous, like a toaster. You know, the first page of the manual these days will have a big warning about 10 different ways that you could die from using a toaster. So he gives a warning right at the beginning here, before speaking about what's to come and when. It's about not being deceived. And I think we have to really listen hard here. There's a reason that Jesus gave this at the beginning, not to say midway through or not at the end. It's right at the beginning. Take heed that ye be not deceived. For many shall come in my name. Now Ellicott points out that the underlying Greek here is I am he, not I am Christ. So many shall come in my name, saying I am he, or literally I am divine. And these are the false prophets. And I think when I was covering this, probably in the Gospel of Matthew, I reported on a number of commentators historically who have gone through the records of that period, particularly in the Jewish historian Josephus. There were up to, I think, 40, was it 27 or 47, some large number, greater than 24 false prophets were known of in the Holy Land between this prophecy of Jesus and the fall of Jerusalem. So as times got more and more fraught, and the frenzy, the kind of the panic set in more and more within Palestine in those decades, people were looking more and more for some form of divine escape, and that led to these false prophets. And Jesus here is saying, be not deceived. The time draweth near, but go not after them. Go not after them. And indeed, many died following these false prophets because they were led in futile insurrections, which were just quashed by the Roman armies, and it was just almost suicide. And in these last 3 verses of today's reading, Jesus starts to speak about what kinds of things will be happening prior to Jerusalem falling. That you will hear of wars and commotions, and the word commotion there is, I think, translated by Bengal rather as sedition. So this would be not just wars, but also essentially civil unrest. And that's very relevant because this was an extremely tumultuous time in Rome itself, with all sorts of shenanigans going on in Rome with the different emperors that ruled in those days. Coming to a head, indeed, in 69 AD, which is known in Roman history as the year of the 4 emperors. Such was the anarchy, essentially, amongst different power groups in Rome. You shall hear of these wars and the sedition. Be not terrified. These things must first come to pass, but the end is not immediate. Nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be natural disasters in many different places. There will be famines and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. And so Jesus indicating that it will be an extraordinarily fretful and fraught time for the Jewish people leading up to the fall of Jerusalem, because in a sense, with the crucifixion of Christ, that was their last chance to pull out of this nosedive that's been taking place for quite some time. As I've mentioned, Josephus, the Jewish historian, pointed out that the Jewish culture was in a terrible state in those years. And you only have to look at the political situation under the Herodian dynasty that had been in power for many decades, and how corrupt and brutal that was, and the Pharisees unable to really deliver a satisfying theological culture for the Jewish people. Hence, just the demand people had to listen to someone like John the Baptist and then to follow Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So that nosedive, they could have pulled out of it during the ministry of Christ had they not hated him, and the message being meekness and love. But this was all meant to be. Jesus knew from the very first day what the end of this was to be, and he avoided at all costs becoming a ruler by might, a king in the mold of David, enslaving the population. Not that King David did that, but that would be the nature of it given his divine authority, and that was not in any way the ministry. It had to be a ministry teaching love, teaching compassion, teaching mercy, ending with Jesus taking upon himself the sins of mankind for our salvation. And perhaps just to end this commentary today with a quotation from the great Roman historian Tacitus, probably the most famous Roman historian, who wrote about this whole period in his histories and his annals, covering mainly history in Rome itself, but also around the empire, and with particular emphasis in the histories on the Roman Jewish wars. But speaking of this period, he wrote the following. Just finding my quote, I apologize. So Tacitus wrote, "It was a time rich in disasters, horrible with battles, torn with seditions, savage even in peace itself." And I think that's a very beautiful summary of those tumultuous times that Jesus himself prophesied around 30 AD.